Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is our final session in a 3-day summit, and I'm really happy that you're able to be here. It's sunny out, so I really appreciate you making the time for this. I'm just going to do a quick Zoom housekeeping. So we're currently in Zoom webinar. So as in that format, as an attendee, you can either send comments in the chat that's going directly to the all the panelists here. You can enter your questions into the Q&A, and you can find all of that at the bottom of your screen. As far as questions, we're going to hold all the questions to the end. So as you think of them, just go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and that way we sort of have a list of all the questions. And if time allows, we will probably ask you to ask your question verbally if you're open to it. So that way it feels a little more interactive. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Sky, who's going to open the final session. Thanks, Sky.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. My name is Sky Morris, and I'd like to welcome you formally to the Southern Vermont Economy Summit's closing keynote session, Community as Corporation, Talent Retention in Low Status America, presented by Majora Carter. Majora Carter is a real estate developer and an urban revitalization strategy consultant. I also specialize in real estate development and downtown revitalization as a partner at M&S Development in Brattleboro, and I'm humbled to be sharing the stage with Ms. Carter. I can tell you that Majora Carter is an absolute superstar, not only in what she is able to achieve in her own right, but also in the way she shares her work and inspires others to improve their communities. But you don't have to take my word for it. Majora is both a MacArthur Fellow and a Peabody Award-winning broadcaster. She's responsible for the creation and successful implementation of numerous economic developments, technology, green infrastructure projects, policies, and job training placement systems. We're extremely fortunate to have Ms. Carter here with us today. I want to take a moment to thank our community keynote sponsors before we get underway. Stevens & Associates, M&S Development, and MSK Engineering. Jason Dolmich of MSK Engineering will close out the session, so we'll hear from him in a little bit. But for myself, speaking on behalf of M&S Development and Stevens & Associates, we chose to sponsor this element of the Southern Vermont Economy Summit because we believe that our small cities and towns have incredible untapped potential, thanks to the unmatched beauty of our state, the recreational opportunities, our high quality of life, and our strong sense of community. But we face challenges when it comes to attracting high quality businesses and individuals to come live and work in our beautiful state. And fortunately or unfortunately, we're not alone. There are other small communities and large communities across our country who face similar challenges. And there are brilliant people working hard to find workable solutions. As an integrated design and development team, M&S Development and Stevens & Associates believe in the promise of collaboration. And we believe it is so important to invite thought leaders and proven doers into the conversation. And it's for this reason that we are proud to sponsor this keynote presentation. Majora Carter is both a thought leader and a proven doer. Majora applies her corporate consulting practice focused on talent retention and reducing brain drain in American low status communities. She has firsthand experience pioneering sustainable economic development in one of America's most storied low income and low status communities, the South Bronx. Majora and her teams develop vision, strategies, and the type of development that transforms low status communities into thriving mixed use economies. Her approach harnesses capital flows, resulting from American reurbanization to help increase wealth building opportunities across demographics. Specifically, demographics left out of all the historical financial tide changes, something that we in rural communities are all too familiar with.
Mhm.
Majora's work produces long-term fiscal benefits, not just for individuals, but for governments, residents, and private real estate developments throughout North America. She is quoted on the walls of the Smithsonian of African-American history and culture in DC, saying, nobody should have to move out of their neighborhood to live in a better one. We could not agree more. And with that, I am pleased to introduce Majora Carter.
Thank you so much, Sky. And I'm gonna share my screen a little bit. There we go. All righty. So again, thank you so much, Sky, for that. It's always lovely to hear that I've got partners in this good trouble that we're trying to get through. And because I'm from an inner city community, but the bottom line is there are places all over this country that look very different from mine that experience the same things. And so what we refer to, so I grew up in what I call a low status community. And it's the kind of place where inequality is simply assumed, where there are plenty of environmental burdens, or everyone's assumed to be low income, and there is a lot of poverty in those communities. Health outcomes are lower, educational attainment's lower, and it's a kind of place that people just assume that there's a lack of hope. But most importantly, inequality is assumed from both inside and also outside the community. And so you just grow up kind of feeling that way. And so since I grew up in a place like that, in the South Bronx in New York City, in the 19, I was born in 1966. I was in a position where, hold on a second. Why is this not working now? There we go. So I grew up in 1966. So I think I was probably about 4 when this picture was taken. And I was, I'm sure I was on the phone with Santa Claus, just telling him that the Easter Bunny was, telling me that I was being really, really good. So he should just understand that. But the most important thing is that I was definitely in this environment that I grew up in. Even though I lived in a place there was a lot of love in my home, I grew up with the neighborhood literally burning around me. By the time I was about 7, the neighborhood was known as the burning Bronx, nationally. We were like a poster child for urban blight, in part because it was. Landlords were literally torching their buildings because there was so little financial investment in those communities in the form of whether there were loans, or grants to small businesses. And landlords were torching their buildings to collect insurance money because that was the kind of financial investment that they got. And it was really just a really unpleasant place to be in a bunch of different ways. My brother was killed at the beginning of the summer that I turned 7. Both buildings at either end of my block burned down, at the end. And it was, again, the kind of place that taught me that, especially since I was like a little smart kid, that you were going to grow up, I was going to grow up and be somebody, and move myself out of there. And because we were taught to measure success by how far you got away. And so to see the kind of, what was left, after much of that really also paved the way for many of the environmental burdens that we experienced. Because when my dad moved to the community back in the 1940s, we were actually a walk to work community, which meant that there was light manufacturing that people would walk to, from the residential section and, for work. And instead, the waste infrastructure and then later on power generation, sewage treatment took over in that area, in this one small area as well. And And it really paved the way for many people to feel like, yeah, it's time to grow up and get out. And so, and I used education as a way to get out. I mean, from the time I was a little kid, and, I decided that I was going to get myself out using education. And I went to one of the best public high schools, actually one of the best high schools, period, in the country, called the Bronx High School of Science. And, and again, I was well equipped and equipping myself, to grow up and get out. And that's the way that we do. So now it's interesting because my work now is all about real estate development and urban revitalization. And it's about specifically applying a talent retention approach to our communities, because we know that in a low status community, it's not like there aren't fabulous and talented people that are growing up, that were born and raised there. Of course they are. They're just never led to believe that they can build the kind of lives in those communities that they aspire to by staying in those places. And we realize that, in part, it's because we haven't been creating the kind of lifestyle infrastructure, and physical infrastructure, built environment infrastructure that makes people feel like their social and emotional, as well as their, economic needs are actually being met. It's like we're creating the kind of communities that instead make people feel like they need to leave if they're going to get out of them. We're not encouraging them to feel like they can invest in their own hometown. And so, I realized, seeing myself as this 13-year-old kid, back in the day, I was the epitome, of kind of the brain drain that was there. And I realized that, now, oh gosh, 40 some years later, that there's still that same kind of feeling in my own hometown and hometowns and other hometowns like it, which is basically we're more defined by our deficits, and the problems that are in our communities instead of the aspirations that we have. And some of that was evidenced in the fact that because we would do hundreds of surveys and focus groups just to really get a better sense of what were some of the hopes and needs and aspirations of people, going through, just going through their own lives. Like, what were they looking forward to? And we use that as a basis for like determining the like our approach to development. And so interestingly enough, we would ask young people, in our community, and just to be real clear, we've had more kids graduating and going on to college from the South Bronx, which is where I'm from. I don't think I said that before. Sorry about that. But coming from the going from the South Bronx onto college than we've had in the past 30 years. Actually, more than 30 years. And so everybody's super proud, of that, including the kids themselves. And so we would ask them, so what do you think the neighborhood needs now? And they'd say, oh, well, we need more homeless shelters, and we need more, affordable housing for very, very poor people. We need programs for kids. And it was always sort of amusing to me that they were like, programs for kids, and it was just like these kids were like 2-3 years younger than they were but whatever, I thought it was adorable. And and then they say, and then we'd ask them, and like, so oh, we need more health clinics too, because everybody's always got some kind of issue, and health issue anyway. And then they were like, okay, so when you graduate and you go to college and you get yourself a good job, are you planning on coming back here or to a neighborhood like that or like this? And they were just like, and they would literally physically recoil and be like, why would I do that? Like, I'm gonna make something of myself. I'm gonna get an education. I'm gonna grow up and I'm gonna get out of here. And we thought that that was a really interesting, idea, to recognize that, because they were really kind of, it was already so ingrained in them that if they were going to be something, they couldn't do it here in their own community. They were not invested in the idea that something good could come of places like this. And so what I thought was really interesting is that, so we had to ask ourselves, like, is poverty, a cultural attribute? Because when you hear, honestly, the nonprofit industrial complex, even the way government, tends to treat, low status communities, it's almost as if they kind of plan and do development in a way where poverty is just like part of the DNA, and it's not really going to change. And so it's almost as if it's synonymous with neighborhood preservation. And I was like, that's kind of crazy. And so that's why we would ask and started doing the kind of targeted surveys when we would ask people, so is poverty a cultural attribute? And of course, we couldn't exactly ask it that way because that's super policy wonky and people don't talk like that. So, but we would ask them, like, well, what are you looking for? in the neighborhood that you desire, and what do you not like in the one that you're in. And lo and behold, not that we were surprised, the things that they wanted were the things that were not readily available, in their own community. Everything, things from cafes and coffee shops, restaurants, just places to hang out in, nice parks. Even though now we actually do have those, they wanted housing that actually matched their income, because there was never this idea. And as when we were talking to folks, that why people were leaving the neighborhood was because they didn't, it was crime or anything. It was just like, no, there's just not stuff here for me, including housing that, I really want to live in, that is actually made for me. Because right now, affordable housing happens in communities like this, and it's really only for a very poor, subsection of the population. Their subsidies are not being, utilized in communities, for different ranges of income. And I find that people would find that really difficult, especially if they wanted to stay in the neighborhood, like close to their family or anything, things like that. And so the things they didn't want were the things that they were just like, I don't want to see this kind of stuff anymore at all. And so, sorry. And so what was really interesting is that we recognized that that even though on a lot of levels, there were folks who definitely were just like, there's no real value in the community anyway, it's never going to get any better. And if people in our own community felt that way, there were people from outside the community that absolutely did not feel that way. So these are actual uh, the kind of solicitations that literally have come to my door, slipped under it by mail. I get phone calls, of predatory speculators asking me to sell my house for cash. Some actually get really demanding, where it's just sort of like, why would you stay there? I mean, literally, like, I've gotten phone calls like that. It's like, this is the best offer you're ever going to get. And it's just like, really? Okay. But anyway, so it's like, but the assumption is, and they're often right, sadly, is that many of us in our own communities don't realize that the value that's in our communities, and they're counting on that. And but when we lose, the kind, when people from our own communities don't see the value in, of course we become, fall victim and prey, to these predatory speculators as well. But when we would see these kind of uh, banners, within our neighborhoods that people would hang up on telephone posts, we would literally rip them down. And so one time we actually posted it up on Instagram, and I love this response that we got from someone who basically said that what she does is have her kids call these people back when they call her house, and basically tell them to get away from their inheritance, which I just absolutely love. But so we've had this kind of but we know for a fact that there's, when it comes to low status communities, that there's really two kinds of real estate development. There's the kind that assumes that the neighborhood's going to stay poor, and so you see it, in terms of the kind we call it poverty level economic maintenance, which somebody's making money, but it's not necessarily benefiting the people in the community. And you see it in the kind of like food choices that you have available. Is there a diverse array, from farmers markets, to good supermarkets, to, health foods, even fast food, but is there a diverse array, or is it only the certain types that make it feel like it's not that great for your body? There's places to spend your money, but generally most people feel like there are many nicer and even less expensive options outside of their own community. I'm a girl, I love a bargain just like everybody else, but we've noticed that in low status communities, 99-cent store or dollar store, sometimes they're called, essentially they proliferate in just really crazy ways. Like, there's literally three within a 3-block radius in my neighborhood. And then there's also a way, there's, the multi-billion-dollar economic engine that is actually the pharmaceutical industry, do very, very well in low status communities. So you see a lot of that there because of the lifestyle related illnesses, from diabetes and obesity, heart conditions, things of that nature. And then there's also ways, almost always, to get self-medicated as well. You are not, or won't generally find ways to actually grow your cash or your financial assets, because instead there's more of the extractive nature of the financial services industry here, from check cashing and pawn shops, rent-a-centers, payday loan places, as opposed to banks and credit unions. And again, last but definitely not least, there's the prevalence of very highly subsidized affordable housing, but generally for the lowest income bands. And again, for subsidies, for the most part, they're done, not because, okay, maybe I'm stretching, but I don't think so. It's, done not because folks are just like in love with poor people. They're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts, but the subsidies actually pay, big developer fees. And, for the trouble to go about doing them, you're compensated in pretty big ways. So that's why developers do it, not because it's like, they're like, getting mitzvahs or anything like that. So it's a really interesting dynamic. But what we know, and when all of these things get concentrated statistically, when you concentrate poverty, you are actually concentrating the prevalence of lower educational attainment, higher rates of people being incarcerated, actually, or having their families associated with it in some respect, lower health outcomes, higher rates of poverty, and also, of course, unemployment. And I think overwhelmingly, there's this sense of the lack of hope, thus brain drain happens when you're raised and you're led to believe that you can grow up and be somebody. If we measure success by how far we get away from our communities, and I want to be real clear, it's low status doesn't necessarily mean inner city. Like, low status communities, they can be on reservations, they can be in all white, former Rust Belt towns, that actually used to be booming. They could be in rural Vermont. They're all over the place where we're led to believe that staying in a place like that is not something that you can count on to enhance your life. And we feel that what we're doing is, when we don't create the lifestyle infrastructure in those communities for people to feel socially, emotionally, and financially invested, then what we're doing is literally creating a reason to not have the promise of America in all places in America. And so that's why our approach to development really revolves around this talent retention strategy. First of all, people need to know that they alone are the biggest asset in those communities. And that's the beauty that is there, that human capital. But then there's also, you got to create the things that reflect back on them in terms of their built environment, and have places where people can actually have that kind of social interaction so that they know that they're not alone. We need to promote community, but not necessarily through a community center, which we know that often I see a lot of developers, especially when they go into lower status communities, they'll like, oh, we're building this affordable housing, we're building a community center. I have never, ever, ever met anyone from a low status community who wanted to move to another one because there were more community centers. It just doesn't work that way. So, quality housing, with good paying jobs and a range of incomes. So that's really important. Nobody wants to, especially if you're from a low status community, you don't want to conflate the poverty that's prevalent there, even if that is you for a moment, because that's the thing about poverty. It's not part of your DNA. It's a moment. And hopefully we can create the opportunity so that it's not like a constant, so it's not a cultural attribute. And we don't want, because that doesn't feel good for anybody. And we want communities that make people feel great, because then you could pass it on, in everything that you do. And so, I've been working on stuff like this, for a while, even before we had this whole idea of talent retention. But it was really all about focusing people on helping them to understand that their community was not just this repository for all the bad things that wealthier and now in New York City's case, whiter communities could afford to avoid. So we really were looking at our land, as a place that could inspire folks to feel like this is a place that we would want to stay in. And I know that doesn't look like anything one would want to stay in, but around the time when I first started discovering that our city and state were planning on not just continuing to use our place as a repository for the waste infrastructure that we already had there, but actually adding a ton more, that's when I started thinking about, like, well, if this is the way they're thinking about using our land, then we have to propose an alternative for our communities to see otherwise. And so we actually focused on actually transforming this street end that dead ended at the Bronx River into a park. And so it started off really slowly, which was basically because it had been used literally for about 30 years as a dump, and you could imagine the compound that compounded over years. And I didn't know, most of us didn't even realize that we could even get to the river, because there was so much either industry and, in this case, just trash that literally blocked the view to the river from the neighborhood, but we were able, various beautiful ways, you're able to get like to leverage, attention and some resources into the space to turn it into this beta version. But then we had to think about, well, what are we doing so that we can get people down to the park, because we don't even have the experience of being a waterfront community. So how do we, create programming so that folks would actually want to be a part of it? So we did boat building programs and canoe rides and lots of parties, and just had all sorts of fun. And this is still to this day one of my absolute favorite photos of me in the world, because I'm clearly just posing, and I'm actually sort of like smiling through my teeth and talking, to the person who's taking the pictures, like, take my pictures, like, this has got to be immortalized while these guys are doing all the work, which was kind of cool. And so we went from this, to this beta version. And this is the Hunts Point Riverside Park, like literally after the last bits of, flowers and, butterfly bushes and all that stuff was pretty much put down in the park back in 2006. And it really was just this awesome, kind of moment when folks started to realize that, number one, we had this amazing natural resource, and you're right, literally within blocks of the nearest resident. And and it was just this beautiful spot that just made people feel like, oh my goodness, this is ours. And we didn't realize we had anything that's beautiful here. I did get married there back in 2006. And the real reason why I even found that spot was because of that dog named Xena, who literally pulled me into the dump when it was still a dump accidentally. And then I realized it was dead ending at the Bronx River. And then I was like, oh, we can do something here. And that was kind of fun. And so, but it also was a really cool spot to get married in, I got to tell you. And yes, and we are now a national award winning park. And there goes Xena with her well-deserved award. But then, that was many years ago. And we realized that it's creating this infrastructure, physical infrastructure in our community was definitely an awesome place. Again, having the kind of places that reminded people that there was beauty in their neighborhood was super, super smart. And it just made people, and people needed a place to like chill, frankly, but we also needed places to gather, in ways that I think are, outside of parks. And so what we developed was, we kept hearing that people were leaving the neighborhood to go to places like internet cafes and stuff like that, and other restaurants, etc. And so basically we were like, and we tried to get someone to come in and, and who said they wanted to open up coffee shops. Never happened. And certainly Starbucks was like, not even, the market was just too low for them. They didn't care. And so what we did was we partnered with a group, a roast house, like in another part of New York City, and they had several coffee shops downtown, and they took a chance on working with us. They were called Birch Coffee, and they were awesome. That's some of the best coffee in New York City. And but we realized that we needed to like actually go out on our own. And so we really sort of like took it to another level and rebranded ourselves as the Boogie Down Grind. And so for those of you who don't know, another name for the South Bronx is we're also the birthplace of hip hop. And so Boogie Down is literally like one of our original names. So we're super excited about that. And so we basically made ourselves like an homage to our hip hop culture, because that is a culture that is ours, that we claim very, very much so. And so we were doing open mics and, fashion shows and, a credit repair workshops and book signings. I mean, it was, people were in our community and didn't even know the talent that was here, because we didn't have the place to hang out and to show each other, how beautiful we were. It was such a really fantastic, kind of space to be in, when we realized that there was not just a desire, but a need for people to feel that way. And we were super excited. I think for us, it just seemed like it totally made sense, because, we would often hear this idea that, when you hear about coffee shops, oh, they're the harbinger of gentrification. And it seemed, kind of weird to us in a bunch of different ways. One of which was that when you stop and think about it, first of all, coffee literally comes from the blackest places, on the planet. And it's literally the blackest beverage on it as well. So I was just like, I don't quite understand this. Like, why did it suddenly become sort of like, the purview of only white guys with ironic glasses and skinny jeans? Like, no, it's not just that, playing bongos or something. It doesn't work that way. So I felt like it was time for us to get into it. So it made perfect sense, even though I wasn't trying to get into the coffee shop business. But we realized we needed to build that kind of infrastructure as part of our talent retention strategies, just to see if it worked. And But we also, so I just thought, well, everybody's going to be, kind of into it in some way, shape, or form. But we didn't realize just how much like the coffee shop drama was how it was impacting some folks, and in part because I used the term called self gentrification when I was describing like our approach to development, to community development, which is a term that I got from the head of a historically Black college down in Charlotte, North Carolina, and he used it to describe the work that was being done between the college and the community and financial institutions that literally supported young developers from that community to do development in their own hometown. And so some folks were, of course, just like, oh, they saw any development happening and they just assumed it was somebody else coming from outside. And the head of the school was just like, what are you talking about? No, these, if anything, it's not gentrification. If anything, it's self gentrification, because these are people from your own community. And I thought that was an interesting phrase, and I used it a few times, including in a New York Times article. And after a month of being open, this was literally a little sticker campaign. They were small. They were just only about half dozen or so ended up around various places around the neighborhood. But it states, we'd like to see the work that we do as self-gentrification. And it was attributed to the local sellout, Majora Carter. Okay. And that went on for a little while, but then 2 years later, we were actually at the coffee shop, and we got protested by some of the same people. And yes, I know exactly who designed the sticker. But this one was a much bigger one, because there were like 10 people outside with big banners, including this one, and I'm selling out the Bronx one coffee at a time, and that I'm evil, and all this kind of stuff. And yes, I made the little smiley faces to protect them. But what was really fascinating was that, and it was so ironic, was that we were also, the day we were protested, we were hosting a really amazing workshop at the cafe, where we brought in two loan officers, one that was offering low interest loans, and the other one was offering 0% interest loans, in particular to homeowners who were at risk of, who just needed some support. And the other ones were for small businesses and local small businesses. So the irony of it all was just really kind of crazy. And I love showing this picture, because this, and the fact that we did take the design, which I kind of thought was kind of cool, and we put it on t-shirts and sold it. But we had local investors, within our coffee shop, and still do. We did a revenue share for one a little while ago, and it's just so that it literally is partially owned in some respect by the local community. And this was one of our first investors, immigrant from Honduras, and her husband's Jamaican. And so it was just sort of like, it just didn't make any sense to us, but life goes on. And this is another project that we're working on, which is an old rail station, it was designed by Cass Gilbert, the same architect that did the Woolworth building and the US Supreme Court building. So he was a Starchitect before they became, that was a real thing. And so, but once the rail station closed down, like back in back in the 40s, it was just sort of like subdivided into like a little mini strip mall. And then after the owner of the ground lease died, Amtrak, who actually owned the building, just like evicted everybody, and the place started to fall. It started to get graffitied up, and I was just like, we can't have that. It's literally sitting at the gateway of our community. This is not what people should be walking by. And we ended up, worked with Amtrak to acquire the building. We hired these young kids to do the mural on it, and now we're actively working on it, to turn it into one of those quality third spaces that the community, that we knew people in the neighborhood were leaving in order to experience. And so what we're planning, so this is what it looked like, back in the day. And, we're working on getting historic tax credits, and the financing together so that we can turn it into an event hall. And which is super exciting. And so like the main part will be an event hall. And so we just did the initial demo, like to start. But the idea is that we can turn it into, the kind of spaces where it can like immediately transform, into a music venue. I know, and I can't wait till we can actually like pack people in again, or just have a wedding, or, just like a cute little event, and, sweet 16s or quinceañeras or things like that, and just have it in the space be in that place. And there's also like an additional space in there, which where, I don't know if, I know y'all up in Vermont, you've been way ahead of the curve for a long time, whereas like New York City just legalized marijuana a few months ago, and we're planning to turn a part of it into a recreational weed lounge as well. So we're super excited, and that's going to be a local real estate development opportunity as well, where we'll be offering, thanks to changes in Securities and Exchange Commission, we can actually be able to sell different parts of, offer revenue shares and different types of investments, to local folks as well. And so, but the idea for us is really thinking about how can we create even more opportunities, within the community, using this talent retention model. And really, we got it kind of refined, years ago when we were proposing to literally take this building, which was an old juvenile detention facility, actually a horrible one. It's the stuff that it was in a bunch of rap songs, actually. It's like a place that broke kids in New York City, called Spofford. And when it was finally, decommissioned, as a juvenile justice site, which everybody was super excited about, it sat on 5 acres of land. And we actually pitched to the city that it could be used as this transformative real estate development site, with mixed income housing and mixed use commercial development, really thinking forward at like what are the economic growth trends, so that you can actually start preparing people for the future jobs that are out there, mostly in manufacturing and education. Thinking about public space as a really strategic way to sort of democratize our community, because, smartly made public space is not only like a great democratizer, but it's also, when it's done right, can it deal with stormwater management, and deal with some of the other impacts of climate change as well. And of course, commercial and retail, those are the things that kind of make a community feel sticky and vibrant, like you want to shop here, you want to like hang out there, and, restaurants, grocery stores, cafes, all that good stuff. And it also keeps money in the community. And so, but for us, it was really interesting to sort of like look at just sort of top. I hate that word, but just basically the way a lot of post-industrial cities are made. There's like a residential area next to an industrial area, and there's a little part where they overlap. And that area, which is the kind of weird place that we know happens where zoning doesn't sort of really apply, and it's a really odd place. But we've seen these kind of places in like all over the country. And here you've got the jail on one side, and yeah, that's residential. And on the other side, it was where the industrial place start. So it's here was a truck truck engine rebuilding spot, and an illegal chop spot. For like what do you call that? Like auto parts, that kind of stuff. But then everybody knew in the neighborhood, because it was such a weird, lonely place. It was where truckers would come and pick up a prostitute, because it was so weird and lonely, and zoning didn't like create the kind of great vibrant feel. But just imagine if you change the ground plane, and you actually create this like really active ground plane that actually has, light manufacturing. So there's 3 shifts with people moving in and out, where there's an entrance to a residential area and even to another commercial sector. So good uses will drive out bad. And so that's a really important thing that we were hoping to establish in the community. And not just because we wanted like one cool place in the neighborhood, but what we really wanted was to raise the bar for what passed for real estate development in our community, and one that created this sense of vibrancy, and the kind of like and safety and security that one feels when you really like where you live, and it makes you feel like you want to spend money there and you want to be seen there, and so we worked with this really amazing team. We had the most diverse team I think New York City had ever seen, on a project of this scale, with more minority and women-owned development teams with equity stakes in it than they've ever had. And our goal was to have about 1,200 units of mixed income housing, including 100 units of low-income home ownership by Habitat for Humanity in New York City. And there were 800 at least permanent jobs associated with the kind of businesses that we were attracting in particular those in the light manufacturing field, and in commercial as well. But unfortunately, our city because they do what they do, decided that they would sort of take the road that they were really used to traveling, which was basically just they went, back to their old playbook and hired, 2 all-white male development teams to do basically almost strictly almost 100% very low income affordable housing. Many years later, they actually did decide that they wanted to build some light manufacturing in, but initially all it was a low income housing project with community centers and and health clinics, and that was pretty much it. So it was, it's still disappointing, and what fortunately for us, we were able to take like the same bones of that proposal, and we're working in Indianapolis now, where we're building pretty much the same kind of project, obviously a bit scaled down because it's a smaller site, but basically mixed income housing, mixed use commercial development with home ownership. And it's super exciting. And we do these kind of things because this is one of my favorite quotes like in the world. It's from Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And when you and that sense of impatience, at his point, it was just like, how do we create, the kind of communities through integration that really are the promise of America. And for us, and it's the same, that is absolutely still a part of it, but it's really about creating the kind of communities that are already here, and showing people that they don't have to move out of their neighborhoods to live in a better one. And just really setting it up the stage so that we're building real, not just, tributes to our collective failures, but changing the dynamic of the kind of monuments that we can build, like those that are really like firmly established in hope and possibility for the future that we know we can create. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Majora. That was spot on. And I really hope, whoops, sorry about that. I really hope that people watching, I think it's really important that you mention that this doesn't just happen in urban areas. This doesn't just happen in inner city. This is across the country. And, I'm really interested to see like, what are the pieces that people will take away from your presentation and apply it to where we live, their communities and their region. I want to hand it over to Christy, who's gonna sort of help navigate the question and answers. And I'm going to go ahead and mute myself.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi.
All right, so we're gonna have some people ask some questions in the Q&A.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay, so I see one from Ricky. Hi.
Yeah.
So were the people who made the landfill into a park paid or volunteers? So it was actually a street. Literally, it was a street that dead ended at the Bronx River. It was supposed to be the extension, or at least the terminus of a bridge that was going to go across the river. It was yet another highway we were going to have. And so initially, early on, it was absolutely volunteers because we just didn't have, it was just, we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know what we were getting into. Later on, I actually started what was called an environmental stewardship training and placement system. And many of the folks that worked on the park were absolutely paid. So that was one of them. And yeah, and we definitely believe in, because there are green infrastructure jobs which were really important, to have there as well. And that's another thing that we feel really, really focused on. And so another question also from Ricky. Hi. Were the people who solicited organizing cleaning the dump into a land park compared to how the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps are managed? Well, I don't know how the Vermont Youth Conservation Corps are managed, but initially, the development of that street end park, literally it came from me. Like most people in my community literally didn't even realize, present company included, that there was even a river that was accessible in any way, shape, or form, let alone that you could see that there was a Bronx River on our subway map in New York City, but that's about as close as I got to it, quite frankly. And so initially, it really wasn't anybody actually asking for this, not a soul. It was mostly me just going, I understand that the city's planning on using another part of our waterfront as a place to put another huge waste facility. We literally have to show something different with what we can do with our waterfront. And if we can do that and then inspire people somewhere along the way, they'll be thinking like this is what they're going to want to. And that is exactly what happened, which was because now it's sort of like people like just assume that that thing has been there forever. And it's just like, you keep thinking that. That's good. I have no issue with it whatsoever. Let's see. And Jocelyn Roderick asks, where do the main sources of funding typically come? Oh, wait, popped off. Okay, there it goes. Where do the main sources of funding typically come from for large scale projects like these? Almost always, it would come from either, municipal or state or federal funds, to actually push it forward. And somewhere along the lines, especially in the smaller areas, like early on, some of that was private. But I just want to make sure, so the things like the parks, that was pretty much almost exclusively municipal funds, some of which came through the feds, but ultimately it was all like public dollars. But for real estate development projects, again, it's like how you build a capital stack. So there's subsidies for some housing, for some of the housing, and even for some of the business development, but mostly it's going to be a combination of debt and equity as well.
Great, and I have some questions that people sent privately in the chat, so I will ask those.
Okay.
If you don't mind. So can you speak to some more detail on the kinds of features in the project in Cincinnati that typically developers may not favor,
Mhm.
but which you can incorporate with a community-driven vision?
Yes, and it's actually Indianapolis, not Cincinnati, but I also love Cincinnati too, so I totally get you. So it's the mixed use and mixed income piece that many developers are not interested in looking at. Quite, frankly, it's there's in most cases there's actually more subsidies for the lower income units, and that's why and it's not easy to do subsidy programs. Like, you do need a team of people to help you do that kind of stuff. Like, quite frankly, we partner with folks because it's a lot to actually manage all that. And so but the higher, but you get higher developer fees for more for the bigger subsidy, which is basically for the lower income units. So, and you do have to be a lot more creative if you're talking about mixed income housing, because we recognize that the more that the concentrated poverty literally also concentrates all the other social issues that most of us of good conscience are trying to say we should actually have less of. And so for us, our partners in many of these cases are often the same, the local groups, our CDCs that are working in those communities that actually have seen the impacts of concentrated poverty and don't want that anymore. And so they're looking at us, as a partner to help them, create more opportunities for their communities. So it was not really an issue when we were like, we only work on project where there's going to be some home ownership and where there's going to be local job creation. And how can we help you get to that point? And so, and it's probably one of the reasons why like we don't have like an exhaustive amount of partners running around, because it's something that we value, and we're consistently working with folks who value that as well. And it's my prayer that and we are seeing it happen more, that there are other developers who are just sort of like, what, maybe I won't make as much money if I actually work to build a capital stack that's embracing of economic diversity in the developments that I build. And I have to be a little more creative in terms of how I can finance these things. But overall, like, it's going to be a project that I'm going to feel a whole lot more comfortable about building. And we are seeing more of that, and that nothing makes me happier, to be honest. It's literally a prayer to be answered. Okay.
That's
So
great.
what? Sure.
Yeah, there are lots of questions.
Oh yeah, there really are. Okay, so I'll try to be, oh wow, it's a lot. Okay, so there's one from Lee. Oh, can you say more about the local investments and investors in your projects and in the community? Sounds like you're using microloans or lending that might have been outside of the banks. Is that accurate? Kinda. It's because what we are taking advantage of is the fact that there's thanks to new SEC rules, that now that unaccredited investors can now invest in either real estate and business projects, because back in the day, it was after the crash of 1920 of 29, they made this thing up about only accredited investors could do those kind of things, because otherwise they were like, you're going to lose your shirt and then we're going to have to take care of you. That's what the government thought, which is kind of true. So that's what they saw. So there's a reason for that. So it's like, but I don't even remember what the numbers were, but they were high. Like you had to make hundreds of thousands of dollars and have, X amount of money in the bank. And if you didn't do that, you couldn't invest. But now, there's like unaccredited investors can actually, invest small sums of money. For the revenue share that we did for the cafe, it was like the minimum investment was $100. But they still got the same rate of return that someone who invested, $10,000 or $100,000 would get. And that's what's so beautiful about this. Is like people are getting to learn the basics and understanding investing in a really particular way. And it's just like it's investment crowd funding. So there's tons of platforms out there. It's all online, and it's highly regulated, and it's really safe. I mean, yes, everybody could lose everything they invest. That's investment, but it just makes it more accessible, and that's what we love about it. Let's see.
Great, I have another private question.
Okay.
Someone is wondering if you could talk about how you solicit feedback or
Mhm.
aspirations from community residents.
Sure. So much of it. So initially, we did a rather exhaustive survey. And I wish, at the time, I wish we worked with someone who literally put surveys together, but they were just questions that we wanted to see asked, or answered rather, like what were hopes and dreams and aspirations? Like, what are you looking for in communities, in a community of your dreams? What do we not have? And what's not making you happy? And so we got a lot of, we got so much intel from those things. And again, I wish I'd worked with someone who literally put surveys together for a living, but I feel like we got so much information about what was needed and what wasn't, and what were hopes and aspirations, versus the kind of things that literally repelled people. And it was really good. That's one of the ways we did it. And then also, quite frankly, just being accessible. Like, honestly, I feel like when we opened up that cafe, like, honestly, I was talking just before before we got on, like I was just there to get basically to open up the place to get some deliveries in, and we weren't even open, and people will just come in and tell you all sorts of stuff. I mean, it's just sort of like, and you get it, and you have to take it in, because that's how you get that feedback, like being accessible, having those places so that there could be interaction. Like, people totally underestimate that. Even if they don't even buy anything, they will tell you because you've made yourself available. And I love that. I just love that. And yeah, there's social media and you could do stuff like that too. But basically, there is nothing like, an interpersonal connection that you can only get by building those third spaces where people can actually tell you exactly what they want you to know. It's amazing.
Totally, that's great. We're gonna make this Q&A a little bit more interactive.
Okay.
So I'm gonna ask Glenn if they'd like to ask their question out loud.
Sure. Hi, Majora. My question really is around the balancing act we have between high-paying or better-paying jobs and the jobs that need to be filled in those service sector positions, and whether or not you've found any interest on the part of communities you've worked to explore the concept of cooperative economies as opposed to the straight capitalist model, where there's more of a shared risk amongst members of the community, but also a greater return potential.
And I think, honestly, the operative word is potential, because even in cooperative economics, if it's not, if you don't have a good business model, it's not going to work, period. And I think that's the thing that I really try to stress, with anybody. It's like, I don't really care if folks are working on a project that's cooperatively led, or if it's like a straight business model where you're like putting in your own money, you're doing your maxing out credit cards and or going to a bank. it almost doesn't matter unless it actually works. And you create jobs, you create places that actually inspire folks to believe in the future of their communities. So I feel like, I mean, it's a question, it's a good question, but I do really feel like we it's sometimes romanticized in ways that are not helpful, to actually extending the conversation about like what do our communities need, which is basically economic development. And again, the actual format in which it's coming in, that doesn't concern me so much. It really doesn't. I mean, I know that probably sounds really harsh, but it's I'm really tired of watching folks, and especially, and I know Vermont's like a different place because y'all have actually done cooperative economics in really smart ways. Like the Vermont Land Trust is something. It's like, oh my God, like I like, all hail. But I found that in many cities where people are talking about cooperative economics, they're basically talking about things that are propped up by philanthropy. And we all know how fickle philanthropy is, which means that it will die, and it often does. And then what do we do? And then we're just like, oh, well, maybe, I don't know why it didn't happen, but then they move on to something else, and it's just ridiculous. So I feel like we just have to recognize, like, how do we create great businesses that respond to people's to real needs, and that are supported by the communities that are there.
Great, thank you. So next we have Tim.
Hi, thanks so much. This is so interesting. I'm super intrigued by you throw out the phrase, I think, gentrification from within. And so the notion of making it better for the people who live there right now from within. Do you have concern about getting to a point where you've made it nice enough that the rents go up and all the people from Park Slope start moving to South Bronx? Or is that just so far into the future that you're not worried about rents going up and driving out the people who are there?
Well, right now, it's interesting because one of the biggest thing that I'm most concerned about is that the few people that are here that still own property, I want them to keep their property. Okay, one, because that's not happening, and predatory speculators it is deep and profound, and it really happens because we generally don't see the value, in our own community while we're still in it. So I feel like, there's a problem that we have, whether it's in New York City and in most places that I've learned. With the bottom line is reurbanization. We're not meeting the demand for housing in general of any kind. So sooner or later, unless we're like building more housing and dealing with it through zoning and also through height requirements or whatever, we will always be in that situation. So am I concerned about it? Yes, but I'm also concerned about, the continual replacement of, because there's so much subsidized housing here with just more, because there is that displacement too. Poor people are constantly moving. It's just the way it works. And but they're replaced by other poor people in the same places. And that's another thing that doesn't ever get the attention that I really wish it would. But again, the other piece is, how do we create more opportunities for housing, in diverse economic levels? And that's a structural issue that we just have to build more. We literally do, unless we're talking, because nobody's talking about population control. So it's like, we're going to see more people have more babies and keep building. And actually we're going to see the amount of available, land and buildings and apartments it's not going to continue to grow unless we actually grow it. So, I mean, it's a really good question, but I feel like we miss a lot of the things that are so obvious. Like, yeah, if we stay in the status quo, yeah, we're going to, like, everything's going to get screwed up. And we're seeing that. We're living in it right now. So how do we create more opportunities so that isn't just the only question that we have to ask ourselves?
Great, thank you. And I know that Sky has a question about self-gentrification, which now might be a good time to talk about that.
Yes. Hi there. Hi, Majora. Yeah, so I love the self-gentrification concept. That's what M&S practices, and what we've been working to achieve through the Brooks House project on Main Street in Brattleboro, the Putnam Block project in downtown Bennington, where we are taking community members as investors and partners. Bennington project was led by the local bank, hospital, college, and other community members to really invigorate change. One of the things we're wrestling with in Vermont across the board is how do we meet the needs of the missing middle? Our construction costs are the same as they would be anywhere else.
Right.
Our rents are far below what you will see in cities and far below what you need to pay for that.
Right.
And there's scant subsidy for middle income housing. What's your strategy?
I mean, that's why one of the reasons why we do work on mixed income, because yeah, it is so much harder to do that. And you hit the nail right on the head. And that's why we say, we don't make as much money, as we normally would if we just totally did it, specifically, under, with the subsidies for very low income. And but it's for us, it's also like the mixed income and also the mixed use piece, and it's about what's the commercial rates that we can actually charge for having like density, and also having mixed income, so that basically market rate folks are actually paying for some of the some of the to bolster up some of the not so market rate ones as well. So it really is, it's a bit of a kind of a shell game that we have to play with ourselves in order to make that kind of happen, because you do have to be really creative, and it is harder. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, we just sit there, with our partners and just be like, okay, and again, it is, how we will take subsidies, because we do want to, create a much more economically diverse, group, because we want folks to, like, why would very low income people, like, we should be mixing it up so that there could be interaction between folks, and also so that folks in lower income levels could actually see possibilities. And we know that you create those kind of communities so that there's more, that there's, I think, a much more shared sense of community, whereas, like, you've got people to look up to, you've also got people to look out for. And I think it becomes much more of a holistic and socially cohesive place, but it also can create the opportunities for there to be more, ways for folks to see each other, but also to, like, literally support, and supplement, some of the ways that things are being built as well.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Sky. Next up, we have Anne.
Hi, this has been a fabulous presentation. I really appreciate it. I was curious, when you're looking at a project to invest in, what are some of the attributes that you're looking for in order to have a sense that this will be successful, like the key ingredients to ensure the likelihood of success? Thank you.
Oh, sure. I mean, much of it has to do, like, honestly, we're very opportunistic, and are we being invited to work in a particular place. And but mostly it's all about, do folks believe in the same values that we have, which is that, we think poverty is not a cultural attribute, that economic diversity is a key, driver in terms of the development of any project that we do. And once we're at that point, then the rest becomes honestly a creative exercise. And what can we bring, to this particular area that kind of builds on what's already there in the first place, which first is the human capital. And then secondly, like, what are some of the goals, that our partners have. Like, for example, in our project in Indianapolis, there's like there's a strong history for the organization that we're working with. It's called Flanner House, that, it was actually co-founded by Booker T. Washington, a century ago at this point. And one of the things that they really are focusing on, is just like the food insecurity issues that they experience, and in particular because that area was such a rich agricultural area, and it's kind of like they have this history, and now they're like struggling with food insecurity. So how do they create more opportunities there? So that became like just knowing that, a small like grocery store slash cafe on their own. And so now we're ramping that up with actually, now a Revolution Foods, which is they do prepared school lunches, and they've grown by leaps and bounds over the 10 years. I think about 10 years they've been around, and they're going to be locating there as part of the anchor tenant there. But they're also building a food hub for local chefs, because Indy has this incredible like foodie culture even now. And so, but there are many chefs of color that have kind of been left out, of actually having, accessible ways to show their food, or food manufacturers. So they're going to build that as well. So again, it really comes from it. I mean, it is the vision is fed by people on the ground as well. Yeah. It's pretty
Great.
cool.
Yeah. Next
Yeah.
up, we have Colin.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for coming up to speak to us. I really appreciate it. My question, do you have like thoughts about building this type of community engagement in smaller places in New England that I don't think quite have have a less well-defined collective identity, maybe as being low status places, and don't necessarily have the same clear narratives about gentrification? That my sense is that low-income communities of color in New York really do have, but in New England, where it tends to be these sort of smaller towns that have a variety of constituencies within them that don't necessarily identify together, and where there's sort of infighting amongst them rather than this collective sort of sense of we're all working together,
Right.
for our community.
Well, yeah, I think what's really interesting. Oh, I see something popped up. Christy, did you want to answer that question?
No, so I've just been marking them as answered live.
Oh,
Sorry.
got it. Sorry. 'Cause I was like, I did, it literally just popped up. So I was like, okay. So anyway, no, I absolutely do think that there's still that feeling, because actually now that I'm looking at this thing now, there was another question that was asked, like, at what point does the community stop being low status? And even though I feel like, it's much more obvious when there's a lot of folks within a community in close quarters, as it is, within a city. But there's definitely, from what I've experienced and what I've witnessed, and from what folks have told me from being from more rural, low status communities, that there is still a sense of, who's got it and who doesn't. And that is so clear in terms of like how folks like see themselves as like, okay, I'm out of here versus I can stay here because I have something that's of value. And so that's where the low status kind of comes in. And so really measure, so how people sort of like internalize and then externalize, they're leaving a community. And so engaging them is all about like, how can they see themselves as being, emotionally and financially engaged in this community when they often never saw themselves in that position before. Like, could this be a place that could support them? And, we've discovered that it's not even a thought, for many people in low status communities, especially the talented ones, that are taught like, okay, you've got a shot if you get out of here, but it's never going to help you because of where you live, where you live on which side of the tracks you happen to be, raised on or whatever. And so when a neighborhood, when a community starts to feel like it's not low status, it's when you start to claim, like, you claim all of it, like you claim the good, the bad, and the ugly, but recognize that especially the ugly parts are not there to define you. They're there, that's part of the history, but they ultimately, are not the things that they're not your DNA, and that there's other things that you can find all sorts of joy and promise in, and those are the things that you work toward. And so I think that that's it is, so that in and of itself is the same, whether it's an inner city, whether it's a Native American reservation, whether it's a rural white area. It's really, it's that feeling that people just know that there's something either wrong or something they can embrace about their community. So the feeling of being low, and it is a feeling of being low status. It's like inequality is assumed, inside or outside the neighborhood. And so if you're feeling like, okay, well, that inequality, that's not mine, then yeah, you can like see your community as a place that deserves and is worthy of your investment, especially emotionally, which is why then you'll want to stay and even pay it forward, by keeping a house, buying a house or whatever, starting a business there, you being happy about that you are literally, creating a model for, the next generation or even your next door neighbor, to see, hope and promise in. I mean, that's, I think, is the difference.
Awesome.
I hope that helps.
Yeah. So next up we have Jason.
Oh, so you've talked a lot about the challenges around funding different income levels in your housing projects. So really trying to create a wide breadth of mixed income levels. I'm wondering.
I'm sorry, could you speak up a little bit?
How about this? Is that better?
Better. Yes.
Okay.
Now I can hear you. Sorry, I'm like going closer. I'm like, that's not going to help. Sorry.
So you've spoken a lot about really having to work hard at including mixed income in all of your housing projects. So I guess my question, if you could, instead of having to create workarounds, if you could change the funding model for housing to include an underserved income level, what would it be? Or rather, I'll broaden the question out and basically say, if you could change the funding model for housing in one way, one aspect, what would it be?
You know what? It's so crazy because it already exists. I mean, the fact that so many of the subsidies for low income housing, they were meant, literally, the federal subsidies were meant specifically only to be used in what they called high opportunity areas. So they were the places that were considered, they were not the low status communities, because like the original folks that worked on the legislation to create much of those subsidies, like intuitively understood, you don't keep concentrating poverty. So no, we're going to pay you guys, and they were mostly guys, to build in higher status communities because the schools were better, health aspects were better, blah, blah, all of it was better. And there was either pushback, from communities who were just like, no, we can't have those folks here. And a lot of it was absolutely racist in the way it was executed. And then frankly, a lot of developers were just sort of like, wouldn't even try. So it actually already exists. It already exists. But since we know that that's not the way they work, nothing, again, it was, oh my gosh, what would make me happy, what also makes me happier would be just going, okay, how do we build, are there subsidies specifically, to reduce the cost of building, like not very low income housing, but the kind of aspirational housing, different ranges of income within low status communities. That would truly be helpful. Oh, and another thing I totally forgot to mention, because I just I took a position, I'm only 2.5 weeks old, with a group called Groundswell, and they're based in DC, and they work on building community power through solar installations, and really reducing the amount that many poor communities and low income communities, have to pay more energy bills. And it's a really incredible project that they have in general, but they're also a part of the team that's 5 different organizations around the country that are working on the Justice 40 initiative, which is, Biden Harris's commitment to spend 40% of clean energy and infrastructure dollars, specifically in disadvantaged communities, according to the federal designation of that. So that includes, poor rural towns, inner cities, reservations, you name it. It's all over the place. And what's fantastic is that their, their idea of infrastructure, and clean energy, it touches like everything from transportation to housing to farming and urban agriculture as well. I'm going to be, working on the accelerator, which is a Justice 40 accelerator, which is all about how do you create, for frontline organizations, the opportunity to compete for larger federal dollars, in with regard to clean energy and infrastructure. And we're talking 40% of what amount about $2 trillion, 40% of 2 trillion. And so the idea that we could actually be thinking about how some of those funds can go to support community development and creating a much more robust and economically diverse, and as well as sustainably built housing and business development infrastructure is just so exciting to me. And we're just super excited about that actually happening. So I am so excited that I'm actually a part of the team that's going to help make that happen over the next year. So, but yeah, I think that's part of it. Like, how do you just, automate, just how do we assume and really understand and make into policy the idea that economic diversity is just a smarter way to help and heal communities, than continuing to concentrate the poverty that exists in them now.
Totally. Thank you. Next up, we have Lee.
Majora, it's so great to be inspired by your energy. I just want to comment on your female leadership energy is so modeling that flow of love into the world. So really, we all need a mentor like you. I'm so grateful for this time. And you answered most of my question, I think, just now about the sustainability, but how do you see that filter really getting applied? It's all a vision right now in so many ways, but how do you see that coming forward?
I mean, it's with regard to the position that I have. One of the things that is so inspiring about it, at least with regard, to the way that the Biden-Harris administration is literally looking at clean energy, as a path forward for our country, is that again, it touches everything, from the food we eat to the homes we live in, to the how we get to and from work or even through our communities. And I feel that if we can make it so that the groups that have been working on this, sometimes with little or no money, because they don't have access, to, the kind of federal funds that can literally, help them partner on much bigger projects that really will change the way that their communities developed. Those are the folks on the ground that have the answers to those questions, or at the very least, ideas on how those questions can be answered. And so being in this situation is the kind of thing that inspires me so much, because we're literally going to be able to, impact the way that groups on the ground, that are out there, experiencing, what it's like to not be able to have the resources to do those type of things in their own communities. And then we will. And I think that's the kind of thing that just makes me go, this is a new day. And I'm just utterly encouraged. And it's because I see people like this on the ground, especially when I was able to travel a lot more. Like, the answers are already there. Like, we're already the keys to our own recovery. We just need some resources and an acknowledgement that this is how we can support our own communities, from the ground up. I hope that answered your question. I really do.
Great. And I know that you touched on this last question a little bit, but I still want to give Marian a chance to ask her question.
Hi. Sorry. Thank you so much. Yeah, so my question was on the low status communities, and at what point it stops being labeled as a low status community. And I just wanted to add some frame to that, because a lot of what you said, the narrative about, the success you get is measured by how far away you get from where you start. It resonates it resonates pretty strongly with me growing up here. I went to high school in Bellows Falls, and that narrative was pushed pretty hard. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
And so for labeling our community as low stat, the thought of labeling our community as low status feels really hard, and it feels like it could be a deterrent to actually getting folks to invest in their own community. I'm just wondering about that messaging and yeah, how you deal with that.
Well, we kind of started to say it, and I didn't make up that term. I actually, it came from this a woman who wrote a book about the way that socially networked teens and their families basically interacted, with themselves, and they realized that folks from communities like the ones that I just mentioned before were often actually a little closer together. It was really interesting, but anyway, I just found it kind of odd. But anyway, but the idea, it was just that it really did much more so than race. It really defined like what expectations were actually placed on people and what they placed on themselves for their future. So it's not an admission. It's not anything all like, oh my God, there's something inherently wrong with folks. It's just the way we're viewed. It is literally just the way we're viewed. And so that's why we can either take it and be like, there is some truth to that. And I know, like, as a kid growing up in the South Bronx, that I embraced the fact that, this place was like kind of ratchet, and it was like, I don't want to be here. And if I'm going to grow up and be somebody, then I have to leave. And that's the truth of a lot of us, regardless of what race we're from, or whether, I had to learn to, like my husband had to learn to drive by the time he was like 13 to get anywhere. He grew up in Wisconsin, very rural Wisconsin. And, whereas like I had a subway, whatever, it didn't make any difference. But the point is, like, there was an understanding that inequality is assumed. And the only way we can address those things is if we acknowledge them. We have to acknowledge it. And it's not like a slur on anybody. It's absolutely not. It's just the way, I mean, this is a country that, like, honestly has never really dealt with race or class, yet we operate in those worlds all the time. I mean, that's why systemic racism, 2020, people started to realize, like, oh my God, it exists. There's this wealth gap thing. And like, I just saw a study, from Citibank of all places, that actually, what is it? They realized the US failure to address the racial wealth gap actually cost the US $16 trillion over the last 20 years. It's a stat. It's not a value judgment. It's a stat. So now that we have those stats, what are we going to do about it? So whether, you're coming from the high school you did, or the elementary school that I did, it meant something to us, and it did inform how we thought about our worlds. And now I'm like, okay, if that informs how we think about our worlds, what else are we going to do with that information? Are we going to use it so that we can build the kind of thriving, wonderful experiences that make people feel like, okay, I can now reinvest? Or are we just going to continue to go, oh, well, we're going to make it so that those particular neighborhoods kind of stay, in this state, of poverty level economic, maintenance until predatory speculators come in? I'd prefer the first one.
Great, thank you so much. And then one last question from Jen.
Hi, Majora. Thank you so much. I could do
Hi.
this all day, but I bet you can't. So I'm gonna ask you, I want to ask you how you deal with the detractors, the folks who you have to stick the smiley faces over that. We're in a similar business. We get a lot of pushback, and I think we try to take, we look for what's in there that we can learn from, obviously. But I'd love to sort of hear what your experience has been, what you've learned, and where you think some of that's coming from, and maybe also how that's changed or evolved over the years.
Yeah, look, I feel like when we put our surveys out there, when we like openly ask for feedback, I feel like all of our projects have gotten better when we ask, and we do. And it's all, and again, when I'm at the coffee shop, people will come in and tell me all sorts of things. And it's just sort of like, I can take it in and go, okay, like how, like what's there that's actually real that needs to be addressed right now. And you literally have to like be incredibly vulnerable and just be open. And that is always hard. I'm not gonna lie. But at the same time, I feel like what a huge gift when someone actually bothers to give you feedback. You know, it's one of the reasons why like I'm constantly giving feedback when anybody asks me. I'm just like, and I love when I get those little like things like, what did you think of this? And I'm like, I will tell them. My husband, it drives my husband crazy, but I don't care because I think it's important for people, and like you can do whatever you want with it. But you know, from the detractors in particular, it's like I just pray for them because I'm not at all convinced, you know, because most of it's done anonymously, even though again, I know exactly who does it. And it's never this like, okay, we want you to, you know, to think about this. It's always just like, don't do that. And it's like, already did it. Like seriously, like that's not helpful. Like that's really not helpful. And so I just again pray for them because I feel like their it's like they're coming from a place of fear versus like how can we like meet somewhere in the middle, and you know, and maybe I do have valid concerns and I want you to know about it so you can address them, which is very different from like I hate your guts and you should die, which is very different. So again, we're very open to creating, you know, you know, a space for folks to feel like they can pretty much say whatever they want, and they will. Um, but again, like I can't take it personally if you're not going to engage with me as a human. I just can't. It's just there's just not enough time or hours in the day for me to seriously take that in as anything except the kind of fear that it is. And I will build a force field around myself for that to happen. And there was another part of that question, Jen. I'm sorry. What was it?
No, I mean, I think that's it. I think just sort of, you know, what have you learned? What has changed over the years? I mean, if anything, I wonder if you've had, you know, you've been doing this for a long time in different ways. And if you're maybe even, I know you've moved in different communities, but I just wonder if you see any difference, not just with the new administration, but just in terms of the uptake of these ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I know we absolutely have seen a tremendous uptake, you know, in the people embracing this, which has been, you know, just on a personal and a spiritual level has been so encouraging to me. And so I'm just like, great, because it's like I'm getting old, and I do really think this is a smart move, and I hope to see more of it happening, you know, around the country. But I definitely do feel that I actually over time, you know, we've just had to again just be even more vulnerable. And it's just sort of like, okay, so tell me why you feel that way. You know, again, if they're willing to actually get to that point. And you know, and just openly asking for feedback, and and taking it in and using it, because that's how things get, that's how I think that's how you get better. And I really do want to get better. It's like I don't want my work to hurt anybody. Like why would I want that? You know, and I'd want to hear, you know, you know, what are you afraid of? And what are you happy about, so that we can do more of one and less of the other. um, but yes, I do feel like, you know, we've had to, you know, be really vulnerable in our ability, you know, to take in, you know, both criticism, you know, as well as praise, because we get a lot of that. So but then again, like what is there to learn?
Thank you. This has been wonderful, Majora. It's you know, been a pleasure to have you take this afternoon to share with us your amazing work that you've been doing over the years. I'm wondering if you just have any closing words, closing thoughts before we hand it over to Jason to close out the summit.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really encouraging that you know, what you've all done to get together to recognize that there's always, you know, something that can and should be done, you know, with it, with regard to community development, whether it's on the economic side, whether it's on the housing side. But really the whole purpose is to create the kind of communities that people feel like they can be invested in. And that's no matter where it is, and whether it's rural Vermont or wherever, it really does. It's really just so exciting, to know that this is like top of mind for folks. It really does make me happy. And so thank you again for having me, bringing in this like, chick from the hood and to talk to y'all. And thank you for seeing some value in what I do. And I hope I was able to share something that was of use to you.
Always. I think almost every word you've said is of some use. So thank you so much. Jason, I want to hand it over to you to close us out.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you so much, Majora. That was quite amazing. I feel like the pictures might have looked different in the Bronx, but the sentiment and the challenges really were a strong parallel for me growing up in Bennington and seeing really just the structural challenges that we have facing us as as a low status community that we are. So I just want to ask all the attendees to stick around for like 2 seconds. I've got some closing things to say and some thank yous, and also a few cleanup items. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Jason Dolmich. I'm the president of MSK Engineers. We're a consulting engineering firm located in Bennington, Vermont. And we focus on advancing infrastructure that helps communities thrive in our region. I'd like to thank everybody and all of you for taking the time to join us at the Southern Vermont Economy Summit. I want to thank all the sponsors who made this event possible, and especially the USDA, who's underwritten the Southern Vermont Economy Project, who puts on the summit. We gather each year to learn from one another and from people like Ms. Carter, who have been creating new solutions to the kinds of challenges we're taking on here in Southern Vermont. I hope everybody has learned as much as I have, and that you will all be able to return to your communities and organizations to continue to do inspiring work. We began the summit with the Brookings Institute scholar who gave us the big picture on rural policy, including what the new era of rural investment could mean for our communities. In our lunch series, we met some of the new Vermonters and learned about why they're here and what's working and what needs a little bit of work to continue to be able to invite continued newcomers in. We've met people from fascinating businesses that we never knew existed, found out that enormous amount of our economy comes from selling products and services outside of the state. And I think just to summarize, or to the best that I'm able to, some of the words that Majora Carter's given us, I circled 4 keynotes that I took away, which is my new term, poverty level economic maintenance. I get to look for that everywhere I go now. And that I think the other thing that I took away was that the importance of making yourself available and being available to taking feedback in order to make projects better. And that I will just reiterate it because I feel the exact same way. We just have to build more housing. And I couldn't have said it better myself. But the other thing I think really appreciate the challenge that you gave us, which is to ask the question, how do we build aspirational housing in low status communities? So I really, really appreciate all of those thoughts. I think they're really transformative ideas. So many people, panelists, facilitators, and participants gave generously of your time to be a part of this summit. And let's go out and apply all of what we've learned to create a thriving Southern Vermont for all of us, and those of us here today and for everyone to come. So a few final housekeeping items before we close the summit. Please respond to the survey you'll be receiving. We take your ideas and feedback each year and use it to design the next summit and other programs. If you missed any of the sessions or want to share or review the content, you'll receive an email with details on how to find recordings. And finally, I want to thank our region regional economic development organizations who work every day to help us chart a path forward. Thank you, Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation, Bennington County Regional Commission, Bennington County Industrial Corporation, and of course to all the wonderful staff who work so hard to bring this event to life. And Sarah, I want to give you a personal shout out and a round of applause for all of your hard work. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And with that, I have the great honor of closing this year's Southern Vermont Economic Summit. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Majora. Really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you in person sometime soon, I hope.